Stallings. We're here at the Tomball Museum Center in the Tice House. It's April 10, 2023. We're here today to visit with Betty Sue Snyder Wood and get her memories of the Tomball area. This is part of the museum's oral history project, and we're recording the recollections of Tomball residents that have shaped and formed the history of this great town in northwest Harris County. You can see this video and others that we've done on our YouTube channel at Tomball Museum. Thank you for joining us today, Sue.
I appreciate you asking me to come.
Is that what you go by, Sue, now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I wanted to start, go ahead and give us your full name.
Betty Sue Snyder Wood.
Where do you live nowadays?
Point Blank, Texas.
What's your husband's name?
Robert Henry Wood III. His name, he goes by Woody.
How long have y'all been married?
Be 52 years in May.
You have children?
Yes, we have 2 daughters.
What are their names?
We have a Julie and a Jenny.
And grandkids, great-grandkids?
Yes. We have 9 if you include all of our step-grandkids as well as our grandkids. And then we have 1 great-granddaughter. She'll be 1 year old next month.
And tell me who your parents were.
Russell and Betty Snyder.
And what was Russell's full name?
Russell Havelock Snyder.
And Betty's name?
Betty Louise Eleanor West Snyder.
And Russell and Betty lived here in Tomball?
Yes, sir, on Huffsmith Road.
And could you describe generally where their house was there?
At the corner of East Huffsmith Road and Hospital Road.
And they're on the eastern side of that corner, right? Southeast corner?
Yes.
Okay. And who was your uncle, Bill?
William Farmer Snyder, Bill Snyder.
And what did he do in the area?
He was the fire chief for 26 years, I think.
Great. We had...
he was also a machinist.
We had a copy of this. You want to hold that up for the camera? You provided that to me a few months ago. That was Bill Snyder's certificate from the fire department, right?
I'd have to look at it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's from the fire station.
Yeah. And describe to us the Tomball Fire Department back then. Volunteer?
Yes, it was strictly volunteer. And most all the men worked in Houston. So during the day, there was not much fire protection. I joined in 74, 73, and had an infant at home, but my best friend and I joined. Her name was Sarah Wise. She stayed for about 2 years, and then they moved to Hawkins, Texas. And I stayed until 82 with the department.
Were there very many women firefighters back then?
I was the one and only.
Yeah.
When Sarah left, I was completely by myself.
Yeah.
And there were fires that I made completely by myself. I took the pumper and went to the fires.
How did y'all do that when you get a call out?
Originally, the call would come into City Hall, and they would sound the siren, and it would go off 3 times in a row, and that's when we knew we had a fire. We'd go to the fire station, which was over there on Cherry, I think, or off Cherry. And you get there and you pick up the phone and you'd ask them where it's at, and then you'd write it on the chalkboard, the address, and then everybody'd go. I mean, they came in and saw that, they would go in their own personal vehicles if the pumpers were already gone.
So whoever got there first climbed on the truck?
Mm-hmm. When you got there first, you would kick on the pump on the truck, and you get in and start it and get the door up and go.
Get out the hoses and start putting it out?
Yeah, when you get there, you would pull the hose, whatever was appropriate at the time. Sometimes it would be just a 2-line. Sometimes you'd have to pull the big hoses.
Was your uncle fire chief when you started?
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever there with prior fire chiefs? Or was
No,
that
I was only there during Bill's time.
Bill's time?
And at the time that I joined, I didn't even realize he was fire chief. I'd never associated that with Uncle Bill. So I was kind of surprised to find out my uncle was the fire chief. I figured, well, and everybody, I think there was 33 men in the department at that time. They all voted me in except for one. I never knew who that one was that abstained, but everybody voted me in except one.
And were your brothers involved too in the fire department later?
Much later, they had, I mean, when I joined, they were like only 9 and 10 years old, I think, something like that. They had to be at least 16 to get parents' permission to join. Mm-hmm. And they eventually both joined.
Ben and Steve?
Mm-hmm. Stevie joined first, and then Ben.
And then there was a later accident. I guess you were already gone from there, or were you still living out here?
I was still here.
Still here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was tragedy with Steve.
Mm-hmm. He died in a fire that was arson. I was actually the first fire I was going to be allowed to go and fight after maternity leave because I'd had my second child. And when the alarm went off, by then we had alarms in the homes, so there was no sirens. The alarm in the house went off. And I looked at my girlfriend and told her, she said, I'll watch the babies. And I said, I can't go to this one. If I go, I'll die. Mm. I knew that tragedy was coming. There was no way I could stop it. Mm. And just within a few minutes, they came over the radio and said they had a man down. Mm. It was Stevie.
Yeah, that was bad. Let's stay on your Uncle Bill for a minute here. You mentioned him and Russell had the welding machine shop on, mm-hmm. Where was that?
On Main Street.
Was that east of the tracks?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The building's still out there, isn't it?
I haven't driven by there. I haven't been here since '82, so I suppose it is. I don't know.
Yeah. What did they do? What type of work did they do there at that machine shop?
They machined mostly things for oil field equipment and stuff, and welded, and they each had their own little hobbies. Mm-hmm. Uncle Bill liked to build steam engines, and have a train track in his yard, and a little train he'd give rides on. He also had cannons, and he would like to shoot them off at New Year's and 4th of July and any other thing that he could call a holiday.
Yeah, I remember seeing pictures of that train. It was like it was pretty big, but it was one that like kids could ride on. Remind me of what size generally that train was.
It's like the one you would find like at zoos and stuff. It's just a little. I don't know what the gauge was. He would be able to tell you, but I don't know. Yeah. But he built a full-size locomotive, steam locomotive, and it used to sit on the Hempstead Highway in front of a restaurant, I think. I don't know where it is now. I heard somebody say the other day that they'd seen it, but I don't know where it's at.
I had this picture of out of one of the Tomball books on the fire department early times, and looked like your Uncle Bill was in that. Yeah.
Even Ben's in this, B.J. Snyder. That would be Ben.
Yeah.
So that was probably after me, because Ben didn't join until after me.
You want to hold that up to the camera for a second? All right. And then this one is the more recent statue that they put at the newer Tomball Fire Station to commemorate all the prior firefighters. Yeah,
they did they have an award, a yearly award that they give to whatever firefighter they feel has done, have given their best. and it's the Stephen Snyder Award. And I came to the first dedication, and John Ridgway, wasn't it John? John Ridgway won it. And it's so funny because, I mean, he's a full-grown man. I remember him as a baby. I knew him as a baby. And I had spanked him. I gave him his first and only spanking I think he ever got, because he climbed in my aquarium. And
Wow.
so I had spanked
If
him.
you could hold that up for the camera
Oh, okay, I'm
briefly
sorry.
for us, thanks. Thank you. And then I also had found a picture of your uncle's cannon that he built.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's Lisa and Robert. That's his kids that are on. And Lisa lives in Little Rock, and Robert lives in Clinton, Arkansas. Both of them in Arkansas now.
Great. So it sounded like he built that camera from scratch, right?
I wouldn't know if that's the one he built from scratch or not. He had several of them.
Oh, look at the second page there. It was from the Chronicle. It looked like that one. He built it on to commemorate
Homemade cannon, yeah.
like the Confederate cannons.
And you know that it worked. He actually shot it off.
Wow.
When he moved on top of the mountain in Arkansas, he built a mortar, a small cannon, that shot bowling balls. And that was so, he was up on top of a mountain, and he would shoot that bowling ball in the holes from bowling. He'd buy bowling balls at garage sales and stuff. They would whistle as they go. And he would pay those kids to go in the woods. If they found a bowling ball, he'd give them $5 for it. So all his bowling balls always got returned to him.
Wow. Do you know what happened to this cannon that he built? Don't know.
He had them lined up on top of that mountain. There was 3 of them out there. And after he died, I don't know if they were stolen or what. A lot of his stuff got stolen before the kids got to it. So I don't know what happened. Robert may have them. I don't know.
This is a picture from another Tomball book of the house.
That's Uncle Bill's house.
Yeah. That was right there beside their machine shop, wasn't it?
Yep. And between it was the little railroad track.
Nice, thank you. And then this is a picture from our museum barn over here. That's an old steam engine that it appears that Bill Snyder had donated to the museum years ago.
Uncle Bill did.
Yeah, that's right.
Daddy donated a railroad work car to the depot. It's in the depot. He made them agree to build a shed or something to protect it from the weather. So it's over at the depot. But Daddy went through a phase where he was riding the rails until he crashed and burned. His wife didn't like that. Not my mother, his second wife.
Yeah. So let's go back to Russell and your dad. And it appeared that first off, let's start with your family. Did you have siblings?
I had 5 brothers.
Who were they?
My 2 oldest brothers were my half brothers. Excuse me, and that was Michael David and Gerald Eugene. And then my first full-blood brother was William Russell. He was a year and a day older than me. Then I was born. And then we had Benjamin Jacob Ben. He was 6 years younger than me. And then we had Stephen Wayne. He was 7 years younger than me. There was a year and a month and a day apart on them.
Did y'all have nicknames for the older ones?
Mickey and Jerry.
All right. And tell me about Willie, Will, the one that was just a
Willie was 4.5 when he died. He had had an emergency appendectomy, and the doctor here in town at the time sewed his intestines shut after he did the appendectomy, and by the time they realized what was wrong, he had sepsis and he died.
All right.
I was 3.5.
And your mother's name again?
Betty, she went by Betty Snyder,
And where was her family from? What area?
the Houston area.
And about when did she pass away?
She passed away when she was 56, and she was born in 1928.
Your dad remarried after that? Mm-hmm. When he remarried, was he already living up at Lake Livingston, or was he still
No,
here in
he
town?
still lived here in Tomball.
Here in Tomball.
They lived here in Tomball for a couple of years before they moved to Livingston.
So, I recall that machine shop and welding shop over on East Main. Did your dad work there all the time, or did he also work at his shop there at his house? So,
When I was growing up, Daddy always worked at the shop there at the house. Before I was born, or maybe when I was really little, Daddy worked for Tomball oil field. He was a pipeline welder. And then he went into business for himself there at the shop there on Huff Smith Road. And he worked there. He invented the flushette. We manufactured the flushettes there. I started paying Social Security when I was 10 years old. Daddy withheld it from my paychecks. And Daddy retired at the age of 54, because he and Mama were retired for 2 years when she died.
and you mentioned the flushette. I know these might have been a little later models, but can you hold that up? And
Yeah.
it's I found these on eBay just to give us an idea of what they were.
We had manufactured them for years, and when the patent was coming up, we sold the patent to Tempo Products, and this is one of their flushettes.
Is that close
And
to the one that y'all would make?
This is real close to the one that we make. Ours was more taco shaped. It started out as a circle, and then we would crimp it with the punch press, and the hose connection went on the end here, and you'd snap it on there with springs, which are in the springs. There's your washer and everything.
So basically you were putting it on an outboard motor so that you could flush the outboard motor with the water hose?
Right.
And how did your dad come up with an idea for this? Do you know?
Taking our ski boat and putting it in Galveston, and then we'd come back, and he'd have to take the motor off the boat, put it in a 55-gallon barrel to flush the salt water out of it. And he thought there just had to be a better, easier way. So he came up with it.
I seem to recall him talking about taking a Coke can or something and hammering it out to make kind of like the first one. Do you remember anything about that?
I remember the story, but I don't know whatever happened to that, if he kept it or not.
Yeah.
But back then, Coke cans were much thicker than they are now.
Yeah. I had here a copy of the patent that looks like it shows two names on it.
Swede.
It says Gulen and Snyder, so it looked like half of it. Maybe I had a patent agent or something involved.
The Gulen, that is, we only knew him by Swede.
Oh, okay.
That was his name. And he, I guess you might say he financed it at the beginning.
All right. So it looked like he and your dad had the patent half and half together.
Yeah.
What it appeared to be. Okay, thanks. And then I had this other version that I found
That was a later model, but yes.
and that would clamp around the bottom of an outboard motor.
Yeah.
Similar style. So tell us.
It basically, depending on where the water intake was on the motor.
When y'all were making these at your shop there at the house on Huffsmith Street, how would y'all go about doing that?
We would start out, we would go to S&S Steel in Cleveland, I think it was, and buy these huge sheets of steel. They were probably 8 feet by 12 feet, sheets of steel. We'd bring them home and we'd line them up and run them through a metal shear and cut them into strips. And then the strips you would take over to the punch press and you'd cut them into disc. And then the disc would go to the next punch press where they would get folded. And then from there they would go to the rack where we would solder the hose clippings on. And from there they would go to the plating vats where they would get a nickel plating, I think is what it was, some kind of plating, zinc plating.
Make it like galvanized?
Yeah. And then we would put them on a rack and glue the gaskets in. And then I would bag all the pieces, and then they would come to me, the finished product, and I would put the finished product with the bag pieces in a little box, and then that little box into a big box and call Central Freight to come pick it up. We would ship it out.
Did y'all have a neighbor helping with that process sometimes?
In later years we did. When Mama could no longer help Daddy, we hired Mrs. Coon from down the street. Her daughter's name was Patsy Coon. She had a son too, but I don't remember his name. I think Mr. Coon's name was Arthur. I'm not sure.
So y'all made those for several years, sounds like?
Yes.
About how long? Or roughly what years?
I would say we probably quit on the, I'm going to say late 60s, late 60s, I think. Jerry, my older brother, I was allowed to run everything up until Jerry had an accident and he crushed this finger and lost it. And then Daddy decided that I needed to just stick to the boxing parts. I didn't need to run the heavy machinery anymore. And I never was allowed to do any of the zinc plating because being a female, he didn't want me to be exposed to the chemicals. For when I had children, he didn't want them to be having problems. And that's basically what we did.
Do you remember roughly when he might have started manufacturing those?
It would be prior to 63 because, like I said, I started paying Social Security when I was 10 years old, and that was in 63.
Okay. This patent looks like it was filed in 1959, so probably shortly after there, maybe. Do you still have any of that equipment that y'all use to make the flush
We
out?
still have the shear, don't we still have, no, we've sold the shear. We still have one of the punch presses. We have Daddy's old machinist lathe. I think we've got rid of just about everything else.
I remember the punch press, at least one of them was a pretty big machine, wasn't it? Right?
Oh yeah, they were huge machines because nothing was digital.
Yeah.
Everything was the old
So
electric and
was it like a foot pedal where you punch?
foot pedal.
Yeah, and the big machine would come down and pop out the sheets, pop out the pieces on the metal. I remember your dad liked boats too. Tell me about his boats.
Oh well, we started out with a little, and I don't know the name of them, but it was a typical little ski boat that everybody had back in the 60s. Then he bought a 21-foot Gulf Coast sailboat. He loved sailing. And from that we went to a 36-foot sailing yacht. And we spent basically every weekend out in the Gulf of Mexico.
And I remember at one point your Uncle Bill had a boat too.
Yes, he did. He was very good at falling off of that boat.
Goodness.
That was one time in particular that he had started boarding. He had an ice chest, and he had 1 foot on the dock and 1 foot on the boat. And he had the ice chest, and that boat's drifting apart. And he just looked at Daddy and says, "Well, I guess I'm getting wet." And then he went.
Goodness. Well, your dad's boat was down at Galveston Yacht Basin for a time when Ben and I were in high school. And
Now, the first one we had was at Seabrook. And that one, I think it was during Carla. We actually went and stripped that boat down and sunk it in the slip to protect it. And that worked. We had to bring it back up and clean it up and everything, but put everything back on. But it was one of the few boats that survived Seabrook, the devastation down there.
And I remember your dad being inventive. He had built this system of weights and pulleys to where he had it mounted around the slip where the boat was sitting.
It always stayed centered.
It kept the mooring lines tight and kept the boat in the center.
Right.
It was a pretty unique design. And later, I guess, he got involved up in Lake Livingston. Built a house up there. Is that near where you live now?
Yes.
Same
Just the
subdivision?
original house is only like 3 blocks away from the house we live in now.
And the house that he built right there on the lake had a steel bulkhead, and I remember he built this little deflector shield.
Yeah, a
on
wave
the top.
deflector on the top of it.
That was his own design, wasn't it? Right. Keep the waves from lapping over and washing out his bulkhead. Yeah. He had a very creative mind.
He was borderline genius. In my mind, he was a genius. He was capable of doing absolutely anything that you needed. If it had to do with metal, he could make anything in the world for you.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking before the video that he was on city council for a while here in Tomball.
Yes. I don't know what years. I just remember he and Wheeler Coe were on city council together because they always butted heads, and to the point that Daddy went and bought a lab dog, big black dog, and named it Wheeler. And when Wheeler found out that we had a dog named Wheeler, he went and got him a dog and named it Russell.
They had a friendly Tomball spat there.
Yeah, they did.
And I was looking up also, because I remember your dad talking about it a little bit about, he was in the Navy for a while, right?
Yes, he was.
Toward the end of World War II?
Yes, he worked on the big airplanes that he was off on Kwajalein.
That's what I was remembering. He was telling my dad, they were comparing notes about the Pacific, and he mentioned something about Kwajalein. Is it an island out in the Pacific, is that right? And what was he doing there?
He worked on the aircraft, on the big airplanes that carried the bombs, and he even worked on them. But any of the carriers that carried all the equipment and all the troops and everything.
Troop carriers.
Yeah, and he would work on them and then go up when they would test fly them. And I told him, I said, "Dad, why would you do that? Knowing there's something wrong with that plane and that you may or may not have fixed it." But he was always confident that he had it fixed.
Wow.
So when they would take it up for a test flight, he'd go up with it.
Let's back up a little more to Ben and Steve. I know Steve died pretty young. What did he do in Tomball before he passed away? Was he working, or
He worked for Dad in the machine shop.
okay?
Both Ben and Steve were machinist apprentice for Dad and Bill. And they were both in the band, the high school band, and Stevie did join the fire department when he was 16. But
I remember Ben was driving ambulance part of the time too, right?
yeah, he went on to become a EMT, I think, for a while.
EMT.
Yeah, and I guess he was 28. He came down with leukemia, and he was in the hospital. They were going to send him home. He had all his treatments, and they had basically killed off all his white blood cells, and he had started producing new healthy cells, and they were going to send him home. And he was going to go home that Saturday. He got up that Saturday morning with a fever and was dead by that evening. Common cold took him out. And it was 1 month to the day before his only child was born. And that boy's name is Joseph, and he is the spitting image of Ben. The very first time I saw him, he was 28, and he got out of the car. He walks like Ben, he talks like Ben, he looks like Ben. It was just amazing.
What was Ben's wife's name?
Becky.
And where do they live now?
As far as I know, Becky lives in Waller. No, but our ancestry, on Ancestry.com, you can trace our ancestry back to Pocahontas.
Wow.
According to Ancestry.com, I'm a direct descendant of Pocahontas.
Through the Snyders?
Mm-hmm. So I told Woody, I said, that you need to treat me like the princess that I am.
Great. But it then went up the chain to Eli Snyder, and then his dad, Jacob Snyder, and then his dad, Peter Snyder, and that was spelled Schneider.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You think that's the way your family name used to be?
Yeah.
Right? And he was born around Pennsylvania area and later lived in Ohio before I guess they went to Kentucky. So it's like a lot of families where they generally migrated through.
They come in through Ellis Island and migrate down to wherever they want to go live.
Yeah.
Wherever they could get free land at the time.
Yeah. Did you hear any other stories about the Snyder side of your family?
I'm sure that I have a lot of them, but I just saying I can't come up with anything.
All right.
I know that my grandma, Verena, lived down in the woods in Huffsmith, and she wrote for the Tomball Tribune for many years. Her byline was the old hag from the woods. And she used to call in, I think it was KTRK, was a news radio, and she would call in, and there was one announcer on that station that she just had a penchant to get all the time. She was always calling him in, correcting him, and arguing with him, and all sorts of stuff. You could always hear her on the radio talking to him, arguing with him, proving her point and everything.
Do you know what her articles were about? What things she would write about?
Honestly, no. Yeah. She always said that she was a published poet. So I know she wrote a lot of poetry, and I knew that. I had lots of her poetry. I don't know what she was ever published in, other than maybe the Tomball Tribune. I really don't know.
Do you know what part of, I assume that Schneiders, maybe they were from Germany. Do you know what area in Europe they were from?
Yes, I think they were from, I want to say they were originally from Poland, but I'm not sure. I know that I heard a snippet of conversation between Daddy and this Parks person one time. We were at this show, and then she was talking about the Snyder name, and she asked if any of us had B positive blood. And I said, well, I do. She says, well, you probably have Jewish heritage. And I don't know how she based that, but that was what she had said. But yeah, Daddy had said we were Polish, and that we got out when Nazis started taking over. Mm-hmm.
I remember your dad liked to cook a lot, or he liked to smoke, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you remember him smoking it, or like the meat that they get from the fish he would catch?
Oh, yes. All of us kids love that. We'd get off the bus, we'd go into the shop, and we would raid the little smoker every day, because we would catch these huge fish out in the Gulf, and he would come and cut them in ribbons and put them in the smoker and smoke them, and it would be, oh, it was just so good. We loved it. We were never able to put any up for any length of time because as kids, we ate it all.
Yeah. I remember, so nowadays I hear people eating shark a lot. It's a delicacy, but back then I'd never heard of eating shark, but I remember he smoked some shark meat that he'd caught on that boat in the Gulf, and he cut them in big old thick steaks and smoked them. It was pretty good eating.
Yeah. We ate shark every time we caught it, and one of the ways that we bring it home, we'd grill it. And it was good. I mean, there's no bones. You don't have to pick the little bones out or anything. Yeah, so it was always really good.
Yeah.
I've swam in the Gulf of Mexico off that sailboat with the porpoises or the dolphins. And I've caught a shark on a rod and reel off that boat. It took me probably an hour and a half to land him.
Wow.
Because you have to go all the way around the boat. You have to avoid all the rigging. And the keel, you don't want the fish to go under and cut the line on the keel. So you have to keep playing with him all the way around while you're landing him. It took forever. And it was about the time that Jaws had come out. And I got it up to the surface close to the back of the boat. And I said, I've got a shark. And Ben and Steve grab Mama's poodle and they get down in the cockpit and start closing it up. They're not going to get eaten up by that shark. He was only like 4 feet long. He was not very big.
Yeah.
But they were not going to get eaten by that shark.
So you grew up here in Tomball. And what year did you graduate from high school?
72.
What school buildings did you go to here?
The elementary school was over off Baker, I think. Over that way, somewhere.
Is it the one later next to Klein's grocery store? Or not?
No.
No. It was an earlier elementary school.
And then junior high was over on Cherry Street, and then Main Street right over here was the high school. And I went to first grade. I had Mrs. Featherston, which Wheeler Coe was talking about her. I was the last Snyder to have Mrs. Featherston. I'm left-handed, and every time I'd pick up a pencil or a crayon with my left hand, she would spank it with a ruler. So for a long time, I was ambidextrous.
She helped teach you to be able to write right-handed?
Yeah. So when it came time for Ben and Steve to go through Mrs. Featherston, she wouldn't let them take her through there. They had another teacher. Uncle Bill also had Mrs. Featherston. So Mrs. Featherston raised most of us.
Do you know about roughly when your dad and Uncle Bill had moved out the Tomball area? I guess it was early enough for Bill to
I
go
think
to school.
Dad bought his land from Mr. Carroll, and I never knew his initials, but he lived on the end of Carroll Street. Dad bought that land from Mr. Carroll, and I think that it was probably around 1950, because Mama had been married and was divorced and had 2 kids when Dad met her. And they got married, they had a short courtship. All I know is that they got married on February the 12th, but I don't know what year. And then my first sibling was direct blood sibling was born in 52. So I figured that, and they were already in that house. Or what Daddy had started building there.
On Huffsmith Street.
Right? On Huffsmith Road.
So it sounds like they came in the early 1950s out
He
here.
built a concrete block house, which sounds, simple, but he built the concrete mixer that mixed the concrete. He built the block form to make the blocks. So he built all the way through from the beginning of the concrete all the way to the house. And for the longest, it was just a 2-room. It was like a half house like that. And then he built the other half, and then he added more on as years went by. When Jerry had his accident, he built another whole wing on the house to house Jerry in.
Jerry was a paraplegic?
Quadriplegic.
Quadriplegic. Yeah. What happened to Jerry?
He was a junior in high school, and he had such good grades that he didn't have to take finals. So he and, I want to say, Rusty Akers and a few others, I don't remember all their names. They were all basically Boy Scouts. They went out to Spring Creek Park and went swimming. And Jerry had asked if he could go, and Daddy had told him no. So he went anyway. You know how kids are. But they were swinging out from the pine tree on a rope, and he slipped and hit the bank, and it crushed his 6th and 7th vertebrae in his spinal cord. And he wasn't supposed to have lived, but they managed to keep him alive. They had to revive him several times. And after that, I mean, he graduated from Tomball High, and then he went to the University of Houston. He basically was a lifelong student at the University of Houston. I think he was 49 when he died.
And going back to Bill, it sounded like he was in school out here too. Did he come at about the same time that Russell did the Tomball? Or earlier, or do you know?
Uncle Bill lived in Huffsmith with Grandma Verena when he started. I can remember as a little girl, which Uncle Bill was probably 18 by then, but he lived in Grandma's house there in Huffsmith.
How about Russell before the Navy? Was he already living out here in Tomball, or do you know?
I think he lived also with Grandma down in Huffsmith. Right. After the stint, they weren't with Aunt Ella, but just a few years from what I understand.
Okay.
And then they came back, because Daddy used to talk about having to walk from the house up that road up to get up to the main road to catch a bus to go to work in Houston. He worked in Houston for Rudy Leon as a welder, machinist, and everything.
Is that before the Navy even? Or is that after the Navy?
I think that was before the Navy.
Yeah. So it sounded like they both were in Tomball schools.
No, Daddy never went to school here. Daddy went to school at, let's say, Jeff Davis in Houston. But he never graduated. Daddy only went to the 6th grade. After that, he went to work.
Had to support the family, sound like, right? Mm-hmm.
And Daddy had an older brother, Carol, but Uncle Carol kind of separated himself from them for the longest. I mean, it wasn't until they all had families that he came back into the picture. Daddy and Carol used to argue and fight a lot.
Do you know roughly what year your Uncle Bill graduated from Tomball?
No, I really don't.
Okay.
Virginia Young Snyder was his wife. They got divorced, I guess, in the mid-70s, somewhere in there. But yeah, that's who lived on Main Street with him, was Virginia Young Snyder. And she's still alive. She's here in Tomball.
Great. So growing up here in town, can you give us an idea what it felt like or how it was when you grew up?
The basic thing I can say is it felt safe. Very safe and secure. Everybody knew who you were. They knew whose kid you were. You were good because you knew that if you were bad, it would get home before you would. So you were always good. I guess I was about 4 or 5. I had this sock of Daddy's that every time somebody, and Ira Lee Curtis was one of the people that always gave me money when he'd see me. I mean, always give me a nickel or a quarter or something.
Ira Curtis?
Uh-huh. Yeah. And Uncle Carol always gave me money, but people would give me change, through the years. And I filled that sock up, and Daddy took me down to Western Auto, to Mr. Wilcox, and I dumped my change out on the counter and bought a tricycle. I rode it around and around in the store, and they were trying to get it in the truck. and I wouldn't get off of it. I wanted to ride it home, and Daddy wouldn't let me ride it home. So he put me in the back of the truck and the tricycle, and I rode in the truck, back and forth in the truck on the way home. But yeah, I bought my very first tricycle, and then later I bought a bicycle there at Western Auto.
What was your most memorable event growing up here in the Tomball area?
The most memorable event was the night that I picked Woody up.
Tell us how that came about.
It was the night of Miss Tomball pageant, November the 17th, 1970. And it was the only mischief I'd ever been into. And I had decided, our school counselor was Mr. Tips, and he had this Volkswagen that he drove to school every day that had a snap-on sunroof. And I decided that he was emceeing that night. So I decided that I was going to buy all the popcorn in the town and pop it and fill up his Volkswagen, so that when he went to get in it the next morning, it'd be full of popcorn. So my best friend at the time, Paula, and I went around and bought all the bags. You didn't buy microwave popcorn. There wasn't no such thing then. It was bags of popcorn. And then it hit me. I couldn't go home and pop this popcorn. My parents would never allow me to do this. So now I had to find somebody that was home that would allow me to pop this popcorn. In the meantime, we're cruising Main Street back and forth. We passed this hippie walking down Main Street. And we stopped and asked him if he wanted to ride, and he didn't. So we went down to the road tracks, turned around, came back, turned around at the high school, came back up behind him, and there was a bunch of the tough boys with catcalling him and stuff. And I said, "You sure you don't want that ride?" And he's, "Oh, yeah, I'll ride with you." So I opened the door, and instead of getting out and letting him in, I scooted over next to Paula because I decided I didn't want him sitting next to her. And we went down to the railroad tracks and turned around and came back up to Smitty's grocery store. He went in to get a Coke, and I turned to Paula and said, "That's the man I'm going to marry." Now, I had a boyfriend at the time I was going steady with from Klein. I didn't know anything about Woody at all. Anyway, we told him what we were up to, and he says, "We'll come out to my sister's house and we'll pop the popcorn there." We had a 9 o'clock curfew. So we popped popcorn until I turned blue, and then we had to get me home. And later his sister brought 2 huge garbage bags full of popcorn to the house to say, "I don't know what to do with this," because we'd left all the popcorn there. So my mom and Dad found out about the popcorn anyway. Daddy kept it for a long time and would just, look at me, and it took him forever to figure out exactly how to approach what I was going to do with all that popcorn. And he finally, he said, told me that this girl named Charlene had brought him all this popcorn that she said that I was popping and didn't know what to do with. He says, "What were you going to do with all that popcorn?" So I had to confess to him. He thought it was funny because I never did it. I mean, we never got around to it. He fed that popcorn to his chickens a little at a time, but yeah. And I went home that night, broke up with my boyfriend. 2 weeks later, Woody asked me to marry him. We got married 6 months later. And that'll be 52 years in May. It was like God just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "This one's yours." So I said, "Okay, we'll go with it."
Share with us any memories you have of grade school or high school. Anything come to mind?
I grew up with the same kids from kindergarten on. They were all like brothers and sisters. They were all just extended family. I remember I had a birthday party probably the only birthday party I ever had. I think I was 9, and my mama had made me this skirt, and I had a new petticoat that had an inner tube in it. You blow up, and it would make the skirt stand out. I had that on that day. Jim and Joe Warren were Mama was friends with, of course, Sue at the time, and Jim and Joe were there for my birthday party. And they had bought me finger paints. So we were sitting at my little table and we were finger painting. And one of the boys spilt the yellow paint in my lap. So we all three jump up and run to the bathroom and strip me down to my underwear, and we're all washing the skirt and the petticoats because they're brand new. We don't want to ruin them. Don't want to stain them with this. And Mama comes in. That was the last birthday party I ever had. She was so upset with me, and I thought, what is wrong? I have 5 brothers. I'm always running around my underwear, and they're always running around their underwear. You know, what's wrong with this? I didn't associate it with anything being wrong with it. There were just 2 more brothers that I had that they were going to help me get that paint out before I got in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
It didn't work that way.
Any other stories from like high school?
High school, yeah. High school was fun for me. I enjoyed it. I was in the band up until I got married my senior year. They didn't want me there because I was married. So once a month I had to go before Mr. Tips and tell him I was not pregnant. And they made me drop out of medical careers. They made me drop out of band. And I'd been in band since 6th grade. And they wanted me there just long enough to get that final credit I needed just to get my diploma. And then I had to work. So I worked for the Tomball flower shop. And, but yeah, it's funny because nowadays they don't bat an eye at these girls.
Where was the Tomball flower shop when you were working there?
Right there next to where Klein's grocery store is now, right there in front of the elementary school.
Is that like Boovinghausen Road or something?
Nah,
Don't.
Boudreaux or something. I don't know what it was.
All right. Who owned that flower shop?
Margie and Sam Benegas. They owned it, and they offered to set me up with my own flower shop. But I learned really quickly that you don't get holidays or weekends, so I didn't want that. So I refused to be a florist.
Did you work during your career or work as a housewife? What did you do through your life?
Well, I was a housewife at the beginning. After the flower shop, I was a housewife. Then I joined the fire department, and then we moved to East Texas. And East Texas, I worked with Woody for a while in the trucking line, and then I was a housewife, and then we moved into Huntington, and I became the manager of Bill's Dollar Store and did that for 9 years. After that, I was municipal court clerk for 2 years under Judge Milstead.
And where was that at?
In Huntington, Texas.
Where is that?
Northeast or south of Lufkin. It's just it's what Tomball used to be. It's a small town.
And how long did you work there for the city?
2 years. We had an officer make a traffic stop, and he was shot and killed. And my paycheck came from the revenue of tickets. And nobody would write any tickets for the next 3-4 months. And so my paycheck dried up. So they had to let me go.
Do you have any memories of some of the earlier Tomball businesses or buildings around town?
Oh, yeah. I can remember going to the IGA Bradigans and picking out flour sacks to make my clothes out of. I remember it had real narrow wooden floors, and they creaked when you walk on them. And the smell, it had a very distinct smell because of the smokehouse right behind it. Okay, where Bradigan's was, that same block, on the same side of the street, the second building from the end near the railroad tracks. Daddy and Uncle Bill owned a hardware store there for a while, and they had an iguana that they kept in a cage out on the sidewalk. And I don't think they were there for very, like, it was never profitable because they couldn't compete with the Wilcoxes and Ace Hardware, True Value, whatever it was, and Nidix. There was just too many hardware stores in town.
You remember roughly what time period that was when they had the hardware store?
I would say it was probably in the mid-'60s. I'm not sure.
Right.
Also, I worked as a soda jerk at Ward's Pharmacy for a while when I was probably right when I was 15, 16 years old.
That was a fun counter to sit at.
Yeah.
Had those little stools that would swivel around.
I learned how to mix Cokes and malts and milkshakes and made lots and lots of banana splits, and I've never had a banana split in my life. And they've never appealed to me, but I've made a lot of them.
Did you ever make
Gussie
a cherry
Rudel.
Coke?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Cherry vanilla Cokes. I mean, just you name it. Yeah. I knew how to do all of that. Gussie Rudel was the lady that mentored me and taught me everything that she had running that.
How long did you work there? Do you remember?
Just probably maybe 18 months. It wasn't a whole long time.
Any other buildings or stores around town that you recall?
I remember McLemore's, Five and Dime. It later became Perry's. It was probably the only place I ever stole something. I went in there and I stole a piece of bubble gum, got out on the sidewalk, and turned around and went back in and gave it back to him and cried and apologized. Daddy found out about that too.
You learned your lesson, right?
Yeah. I didn't even open it or nothing. I felt too guilty. We passed the church, the First Baptist Church today. That's where we got married. It's a whole lot different now than when we were coming here. We haven't gone by the Methodist church. Woody's Methodist, and so I went over to the Methodist with him. So we were members of the Methodist church here in Tomball after we were married. But I haven't gone by to see if it's still there or not.
I think it's a different denomination now, but you're talking about the one on Carroll Street across the tracks, east of the tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah. The building
Peach
is still
Street,
there.
I think, or something like that.
Yeah. The building is still there, I think.
I was born in Tomball Hospital.
Tell us about that hospital. That was right
Well,
there by
it's
your house.
way gone now, but yeah, it was right down the street from our house. I was born in Tomball Hospital. Amelia Spell's mother shared the room with Mom. Amelia Spell was born the next day. And I grew up just the end of the block. Woody and I got married, and the first house that we lived in was between my parents' house and that hospital. So I didn't even leave the block. Then the first house that we rented was on Main Street, straight up from there. First house we ever bought was at 610 Hospital Road, straight across the street from the hospital.
Who was the doctor that delivered you?
Dr. Graham, I do believe.
Okay.
He was always Mama's doctor.
Do you remember any of the treatments that you got through the years with Dr. Graham?
Dr. Graham, yeah, when I was about 13, 14, I suffered from anorexia nervosa and bulimia. And I got extremely sick. And Daddy made Mama take me to the doctor, and it was Dr. Graham. And I don't remember exactly what he told me. But basically it boiled down to if I kept that up, Mama was going to win. He knew that there was a lot of strife between Mama and I. And basically that saved my life because I realized that, if I was dead, Mama had always told me she never wanted a girl. So if I died, she'd get her way. So I started eating again.
Yeah, good. Dr. Graham was quite a character, wasn't he? Do you remember
Yeah,
any
he
stories
was.
about him?
And not particularly. I just know that he ended up with a lot of kids. I know that the house that we bought was from Dr. Graham. We bought the house, Woody and I bought the house from Dr. Graham there across the street from the hospital. I remember the night the high school burnt. We could watch it because this land is so flat here. We watched it from upstairs of the house. We could see the school burn down. That's a good 2 miles away, but we watched it. I just remember how sad that was. And other than that, it was a great place to grow up. It was just a great place.
Well, thank you for spending the time here today with us and coming all the way from Lake Livingston to be with us.
Thank you very much for having me.